impressive group. And I think we
You're the one
yeah. Well, yeah, it's never clear what.
remember my name.
Get going.
Is Pat gonna make it?
Get your attention.
Oh,
Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to call the Thursday, March 31st meeting to order. Supervisor Pine is back east visiting his mother, like a good son, and so we're going to miss him tonight. So with that, we'll do the roll call, and then after the roll call, we will have a swearing in of a couple of people who were not here last week.
hey Dan. You too.
Okay, so we will do this by, I'll say the name of the city, and if you could just say your name, I think that'd go a lot faster. Okay, so County of San Mateo,
Carol Broom.
And Jim Agemeyer.
Town of Atherton,
Rick DeGoey.
City of Belmont,
Sort of here until I'm sworn in.
So he's no name.
Charles,
Uh,
I'm trying to make it more painful.
City of Brisbane, City of Burlingame, Town of Colma,
Joe Silva.
City of Daly City, City of East Palo Alto, City of Foster City,
Gary Pollard.
City of Half Moon Bay, Town of Hillsborough,
Lawrence May.
City of Menlo Park,
Catherine Carlson.
City of Millbrae,
Wayne Lee.
City of Pacifica,
John Keener.
Town of Portola Valley,
Jeff Alfs.
City of Redwood City, City of San Bruno, City of San Carlos,
Cameron Johnson.
City of San Mateo,
Joe Gokus.
City of South San Francisco,
Rajiv Gupta.
Town of Woodside.
Daniel Yost.
And I just came in from Birmingham.
Okay, thank you. I believe we have a quorum.
Thank you. So now we're going to administer the oath of office. Mr. Silberman
So
to,
if you haven't had the oath of office yet, or you just like to take oaths, please rise. And,
I think you should all stand up.
and raise your right hand. And when I say I, please state your name. I
Rajiv Gupta.
do solemnly swear
Do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
and I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I will take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully
and I will well and faithfully
discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
discharge the duties on which I am about to enter.
Close enough. Congratulations. And if you could sign your forms and get them to me, that would be fantastic. I'll be here all night.
thank you, Counselor. Next is public comment, and we have blue cards, and the public comment is reserved for persons wishing to address the board on any PCEA-related matters that are as follows: not otherwise on this agenda, listed on the consent agenda, chief executive officer or staff report on the regular agenda, and board member reports on the regular agenda. So, Eric Fowler.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Fowler. I'm an independent consultant on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Currently a strategic advisor with Menlo Spark. Thank you for letting me share a couple of comments and congratulate you all on setting up your CCE program. Just a friendly reminder that from an outsider who knows and understands this space, that you all are making history here. community aggregation type programs are a major and significant mechanism for renewables deployment. Excuse me. And of course, allow customers to have more choice about the attributes of their power. I think you have a golden opportunity here to take a leadership position and show the value of community choice energy, especially in California. And to that point, you also can, in my opinion, be too cautious. I'd suggest to you that a 50% clean power default commitment may be too cautious and risks your program being marginalized or thought of as rather unimpactful. So I understand your concerns and your caution in setting up this program, but my experience and the data that I see suggests that you can do a higher default percentage on the clean power program for similar or better rates than PG&E. Again, a huge opportunity here. And in closing, I'd encourage you to make a concerted effort to deliver the cleanest power portfolio possible at a similar or reduced price point relative to PG&E, and also to set a clear future goal to deliver carbon-free power. Thanks again, and congratulations again on your accomplishments thus far.
Thank you, Mr. Fowler. Ray Muller, a council member from Menlo Park. Welcome.
So I'm speaking as an individual tonight. I'll let our Councilmember Carlton speak on behalf of the city. So I always like to start off a little bit of levity, but a little bit of background. So I have two children, aged 10 and 6, and much of my life has revolved around, their young life has revolved around what they look at. So I just wanted to share something because it sort of illustrates a point. I'm not sure how many of you realize this, but the time period between Stegosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex is actually greater than the time period between us and Tyrannosaurus rex. It's kind of an odd thing that people, perception-wise, don't realize. And I always think about that in terms of my job working in the business sector, because a lot of the things that we do, a lot of the decisions we make are based upon perception. And the way that we overcome those biases, the way we overcome those things to get past perception is we actually try to apply science and knowledge in order to make decision-making processes. And one of the big decision-making processes that you all will be making as we set forward in this historic event is that the mix and the load that you go ahead and put into that first year 1, year 2, and year 3. In order to do so, what I would suggest to all of you tonight and what you'll see in our letter is that two of the main components you'll be making that decision on is what is commercially reasonable and what is price parity for the market. And what I would suggest to you all is that we could do that, this body could do that based upon their perceptions, or we could do that based on scientific research. We could go out and actually do market surveys and test feasibility, which is something we would do in the private sector, and we would certainly do if this were a private utility. And well, I would suggest to you all that when you move forward to actually do that job of figuring out what the proper mix is and what the proper load is and what that price is, we can argue all we want in here about what those percentages should be, but what we should actually do is the most democratic thing and go out and do polling and ask people what they think, what their expectation is. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Muller. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Oh, please come forward, sir.
My name is Ted Howard, and I'm an independent consultant. I just wanted to comment on two different things. One is the loading order in California, and I know PEA is aware of what that is. But I'm just going to mention it anyway, because it was established in 2004. I did not see it explicitly mentioned in the energy services nor the implementation plan. Is probably a good reason they can explain. But the loading order is, of course, the prioritization is demand response and energy efficiency are top priority. Second priority is renewable energy and distributed generation. And third priority for procuring energy resources in the last resort is a natural gas combined cycle gas turbine. So that's something that the CPUC will be looking for all utilities, including, I believe, for the PCE. The other related issue is locational net benefit analysis. That's something you're going to be hearing more and more, and that's where it's all going at the state level for policies. There's a distribution resource plan. They were issued by the July 1st of 2015 by the utilities. They were already promoted or proposed. And now is the time that everybody's looking into the developed models for establishing the locational net benefits of a distributed energy resource at a particular location at a particular time. So this is where it's all going by 2018. That and several other proceedings regarding energy storage, integrated resources, interconnection, net energy metering, and others are all going to be looking at the net benefits of a particular distributed energy resource, and that's what PCE needs to begin to look at the specific location for each resource. Of course, the major benefits being greenhouse gas reductions, but also avoidance of investment in new distribution grid. Those are the major benefits, and there are others. So that's something that would help now. Of course, PG&E has to be more forthcoming on public data, and they're reluctant to, so that's another issue. But on the next few years, that's where it's all going, and you need to be aware of trying to procure resources, local net benefits that are the greatest for the local distributed energy resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Diane Bailey?
Good evening. My name is Diane Bailey. I'm director of Menlo Spark, and I want to congratulate you all again. So much work has gone into creating PCE, and we have so much work ahead. And I just want to point out that we have a golden opportunity right now to create really significant changes in the way we deliver our power, bringing clean, renewable, carbon-free power throughout the county. And it's not often that you see one single measure that can reduce carbon emissions by up to 20%, and that's countywide. And so we just want to remind you again, there were a lot of letters last week calling to maximize clean power in the portfolio, and also calling for a clear target for future carbon-free power. And I hope that you can find a way to include that in the implementation plan that goes to CPUC. And I hope that we can continue to monitor progress and work together. There are so many exciting programs that we look forward to working with you on. Bolstering our local renewables, increasing local jobs, creating microgrids, and improving community resiliency. So we look forward to all these things, but we hope that today, for now, that you can focus on these clean energy targets. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Bailey. Anyone else want to speak? Blue cards? Okay. Lisa, have you been sworn in yet?
I have not.
Do you want to do that, David?
I can.
You okay?
Happy to.
Okay.
All right. If you please stand and raise your right hand. And after I say aye, please state your name. I
I, Lisa Gaucher,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I will take this obligation freely
that I will take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
and I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties upon which I am about to enter.
the duties upon which I'm about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay, now is that we're going to take action to set the agenda and approve the consent calendar items, which is item number 6 and 7. So somebody,
So moved. Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay,
Madam Chair, I'm just going to note for the record that I'm abstaining from the minutes as I wasn't here.
okay. But our next item of business is to elect the board chair and the vice chair.
I would like to proudly nominate Dave Pine to be the chair of this board. He's done a remarkable job bringing us this far. I think that everybody would agree with that, and if everybody does, I'd like to elect him by acclamation.
I second that. All right, all in favor? Aye. Okay, excellent. Thank you, Rick. Now is the time to nominate a vice chair. And I would like to take the liberty of putting Jeff Alt's name for consideration as vice chair.
I'll second that.
Are there-
He seconded.
Okay.
So did I.
Are there any other nominations? All right. All in favor of Mr. Alt?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, excellent. Jeff, then you're gonna,
I'm taking over, right?
you're gonna take over tonight.
I can do it from here, right?
You sure?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for the opportunity. I look forward to working with all of you on this. So let's dive right in. Next up, we will be, there'll be a county staff report. Will that be, Jim, will that be you?
Yeah, I'm going to start with just two items. I want to introduce a few of our staff, but the first staff member is joining us today, and that is Carolyn Rader, right, sitting next to Gordon over there. And just wanted to let you know that we went through a recruitment, had over 70 applications, narrowed the pool down, and she was our successful candidate. And she brings with her 2 masters, one in environmental science and energy, and another master's in public affairs relative to energy, and an undergraduate in environmental science. And for the past year, she's been working at Stanford in the Precourt Institute for Energy as a marketing coordinator. So with that, I'd like to introduce her. She will be our point person from this point forward. And Gordon and Kirsten will be just taking a back seat to her. She'll be front and center working on these efforts for you, beginning right now. So anyways.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to working with everyone, and we're happy to be here.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome aboard, Carolyn. Thank you.
And then I'd also like to then kind of segue into also another member within the Office of Sustainability who's going to give a little bit of background about the financing and the history, kind of the past, present, and future aspects of what we've been working on in our office relative to the Community Choice Energy Program and PCE, and that is Mike Bolander. And that's Mike, you want to join us, please? And Mike's been with the county now for a little over 12 years, and in turn, we recently hired him in as the Financial Services Manager into the Office of Sustainability. He comes from the Office of Budget and Performance in the County Manager's Office, and so numbers is his game. This is where he's really good and comfortable at, and so he's going to share a little bit of information with you in those regards. So, Mike?
Thank you, Jim. It's always tough to follow an oath of office, but 2 oaths of office in one meeting. The bar is set pretty high for me today. So just a little background on the financing. On February 25th of 2015, our Board of Supervisors allocated $300,000 to fund what we call Phase 1 of the Community Choice Aggregation Program. Those funds were used to hire some consultants to help with the technical studies and also some marketing directly in support of the Community Choice Aggregation. And then on October of 2015, the board allocated an additional $800,000 to support what we're calling Phase 2 of the Community Choice Aggregation Program. And funds in Phase 2 were mainly used in support of the formation of the Joint Powers Authority and to provide some operating capital to get the JPA off the ground. The county committed a total of $1.5 million in funding. So to date, they've allocated 1.1. There's an additional $400,000 that we plan on going to the board with in the future to help fund additional startup activities. And then we also saw a need to potentially ask our Board of Supervisors for an additional $1.5 million to help bridge the gap between kind of the startup costs for the JPA and then when the JPA starts collecting revenues to start supporting their own operations. So payments to date, and this was as of February 29th, 2016, we have spent approximately $317,000 in support of the JPA. We are under commitment or have contract commitments totaling about $930,000 moving forward, and those funds, as stated earlier, will be used to help support some of the marketing and other startup costs related to the JPA. We had also made a commitment at one of our internal staffing meetings to try and bring a budget calendar to the JPA to give you an idea of approvals on a formal budget that we will create and bring to the board sometime in June for fiscal year 16-17. Our office has been doing some preliminary cost estimates, and we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.6 million to help get the JPA through February 2017. That is our cutoff date for county funding, and we anticipate that the JPA should be cash positive by that point and be able to support their own operations. Is there any questions on just the general finances before I move on to the banking efforts that the county's been going through? Great. So in addition to the county support, we're also seeking about $12 million from a local bank, a local or regional bank, and that's mainly there as we go into contract with our power purchase agreements to use as collateral, and also for some deposits that are required by the CPUC and Cal ISO. We've been speaking with a number of banks, and we should be bringing some term sheets to the JPA later. It's still March, so later next month, and hopefully have some options for you to look at and decide which lending partner we want to go with for the additional $12 million. Any questions on our banking efforts? Great. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike.
That concludes the staff update for this session.
Are there any questions for staff from the board? Okay. Seeing none, that brings us to our next item, which will be an action item. We will be approving a resolution adopting the Peninsula Clean Energy Implementation Plan. I believe we'll start with, will be Kirby, or will you be presenting this, or?
Yeah.
You want to start with this,
Yeah.
or Jim? Sorry.
All right, sounds good. Thank you. Again, Kirby Dussel with Pacific Energy Advisors, and I think just go ahead and just remind everybody, we spent a fair amount of time last meeting going over what the implementation plan is, the purpose of that document, the contents of that document, who it gets submitted to, the timeline for reviewing it, why it is that you would include certain information, why it is that you would exclude other information. And so really we're at a point right now where, absent some relatively last-minute comments that have come in today, the feedback was pretty light-handed in terms of the suggested edits, and so there have been very minor revisions incorporated since you last saw the document a week ago. And I think, maybe one of the questions for the board, not having seen some of these last-minute edits, is whether or not we should go through those now, or just talk about whether or not there should be some discretion at the staff level to incorporate some non-substantive items before this document is finalized. And so I think, to the extent that the board has questions about the document, would be happy to answer those right now, or review any of the material that we presented last time.
I think what I'll suggest right now is that we start with the board having any questions or comments for staff, and that we followed by the public hearing, and then we could come back and have one final discussion among ourselves, and then we should be ready to approve this tonight, I believe. So
Super.
I'll start with for questions for Kirby. Rick.
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Okay.
So I thought we had a very good discussion last week. I actually didn't think it was that light. I think we principally focused on the issue of the mix of renewables in the default solution. And given that discussion, I've spent quite a bit of time on the document this week. And I think that there's three variables that we all need to think seriously about here that are at a policy level. One is the issue of the mix of renewables and non-renewables in the default solution. And I think there was generally a consensus that 50% was a good target to start out with. It's the most aggressive target that any CCA in California has done. I think we provide a leadership position for the other people that are going to be coming along as CCAs, and I feel very comfortable with that. Now, I personally felt like there was general consensus about that at the board. I think there's two other variables that are equally important, and one was addressed in the public comments tonight and is addressed in the letter from the city of Menlo Park, which is the portion of the default solution that is not renewables is energy that will be generated principally by natural gas in California. That was what was presented last week in the slides, but it can also be carbon-free energy, principally large hydro that comes from Oregon or Washington, and perhaps if PG&E finds that it has excess energy as its customer base changes, it will be interested in selling some of that energy. I think it's very important for us as Peninsula Clean Energy to maximize, to the extent commercially reasonable, that mix of large hydro so that the percentage of carbon-free energy is as high as we feel comfortable with, given our need to build a strong reserve and establish a commercially stable entity. I don't know if we need to set a target. I think that Menlo Park suggested 70% last week, if I interpret that properly. Personally, that's something I'm comfortable with. I don't think that it's going to be that hard to buy that large hydro. I think we have to be sensitive about the cost impact, but it may in fact prove to be less expensive than natural gas. So I'm just pointing out, I think there's a variable of what is the carbon-free mix based on the ratio of natural gas-based energy and large hydro-based energy in that default solution. And I think it's very important that we be cognizant of that and address that. And I'll be quick, but the third variable that I think is extremely important that we've touched on is how close, or what is our target for the pricing that we provide to our customers. And we've all said, and the PCEA was marketed, that we could come in at a price below or close to, I think the language has been parity with PG&E. I think that's right. I look forward to the date where we don't have to base ourselves in reaction to PG&E, but we can be establishing these positions based on our independent knowledge of the market and our close representation of the customers, which I believe that we will be able to do. But I do think that we were marketed as a solution that would be both less expensive than PG&E and a greater percentage of renewables than PG&E. Personally, I would like us to target coming in at 5% below PG&E. I think that if we come in basically equal to PG&E at this time, that would be disappointing to people, and it would, and I'm fearful that it would increase the opt-outs. And if you look at the other CCAs, and I think it's in the language in the implementation plan, we can move up the pricing and the percentage of carbon-free as we go, and I think that's wise to do. We want to start out conservative. But the third variable, I think, is what our target is. And personally, I'd be comfortable targeting 5% below PG&E.
Can I follow up on Rick's comments?
I'd like to save the discussion among ourselves for after the public hearing, if that's okay. I was hoping this first round would be more questions for the staff on the implementation plan, not a public hearing. But Daniel was next.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is, if you could provide a summary of what changed between the drafts at the high level, I'd appreciate that. And then secondly, obviously in putting this together, you've done some analysis. We've received feedback in the desk item letter, as well as some of the public speakers, about conducting market research, reacting to that. Two things. One, have you already effectively done it in behind the scenes and presenting this? And two, if something else were to be done, how would that impact the time frame? Since we're looking under our recently tight time frame. So my two questions.
Okay, yeah, so with regard to the first item, the changes were largely administrative. And I think one of the items that was on the table, at least it was raised in concept and then kind of raised thereafter in written comments that were submitted via email, was the idea of potentially including a metric related to the GHG-free percentage that would be reflected in PCE's initial resource mix. And so I think that's kind of on the table tonight as to whether or not that item is included, and then of course what level is the appropriate level to reflect in the document. So I think one of the crossroads items between the implementation plan and the energy services RFP, which we'll be talking about later tonight, just something to be aware of, is that the targeted GHG-free percentage that's identified in the energy services RFP is a range of 70 to 75%. So that's kind of, reflected in that document, and that generally resembles the scenario 2 analysis that was reflected in the technical study. So, if that's the preference of the group, we can certainly determine what verbiage is appropriate to express that in the document and do it in a way that doesn't create any potential constraints for launching the organization, but still sets a very high bar. The other item that you were asking about, could you please?
Sure, I'll take that one. I'm John DeLessie with Pacific Energy Advisors. I wasn't at the first meeting, but I'm happy to be here tonight. So in terms of market research, no, we haven't really done explicit market research, and I assume what you were referring to would be community preferences in regards to renewable content, maybe willingness to pay, that type of thing. That hasn't been directly conducted by us. We are aware of research that's been done in other communities, and generally, I think the results of that show that there is an express willingness to pay a small premium for additional renewable power. Having said that, the target here is to have a greener product at a lower cost, which we believe is feasible. The technical study demonstrated that that's likely to be feasible. So I think that really maybe that's something that happens over time as this initial power content. It doesn't necessarily it's not always at that same level, right? Things can evolve. I also wanted to get to a couple of the points that you made in regards to the pricing target. That 5% target, that really is the number that underlies the financial projections that are reflected in the implementation plan. The language in the plan is a little bit more general and I would say maybe flexible about rates that are competitive. The current draft is, I think does not set that explicit target. The reason for that really is that the implementation plan primarily is a regulatory compliance document to enable you to be a registered CCE program. I mean, that really is the primary purpose. And so we've, based on our experience in working with the 3 existing CCE programs and getting these plans through the commission, we found that, and I think this has been communicated in past meetings, that including sort of less is more in regards to that document itself. Right, so I think the targets that you have in mind, that 70 to 75% carbon free, that's reflected in the numbers that will be reflected in the RFP, subject to further discussion on that agenda item tonight. And that pricing target is also sort of in the plan, but it's just not explicitly stated. And we think it's appropriate to keep it that way. Just basically to, I think the objective from our perspective is get that plan certified and get this program up and running without any sort of delays or hiccups or complications.
Catherine had a question.
So I just want some clarification on something. As much as I love seeing all of you, we're all putting a lot into this. We're spending a lot of time, and we're not doing this for the joy of setting up a new electrical company. We're doing this because we want to do the right thing with regard to reducing greenhouse gases and increasing the use of renewable energy. So I'm making the assumption that we all, in the ideal world, would like to have 100%. And that's our goal of moving towards that. And somebody's asked me a question, and I want would like you to address it so that I have a more articulate way and better examples to answer that question. And that is the fear of atrophy, that if we start off at 50%, it'll feel comfortable there, and we'll be getting our padding to pay back the $12 million, and there won't be the passion to move quickly from the 50% towards the 100%. Can you give me examples of the previous groups that have started at 30 and 35% and how quickly they've moved towards 100, and how you feel it's best for us to make sure that we don't suffer from atrophy and that we do keep moving as quickly as is feasible, effective and efficiently towards that 100% goal? Because I understand those fears.
Yeah, good question there. And I think, one of the things to kind of keep in mind, just broadly speaking, when you're talking about CCEs, is that as more of these organizations form, and we've seen this even with the implementation plans that have been submitted and the bars that have been set within those implementation plans, there's a bit of competition out there. And, I think what'll happen over time, and this is very healthy, I mean, I think it's going to really drive where, the clean energy trajectory of CCAs, CCEs, where that goes over time. When you look at your neighboring programs and realize, okay, what are they doing? I want to push the needle up a little bit more. I want to push the needle up a little bit more. And I think that's even happened with the incumbent utility in many respects. You've seen their kind of regional solar programs popping up as a way to infuse more green energy into their prospective customer base. And so I think there's a lot of things that are moving back and forth where programs look across the fence, so to speak, and see what their neighbors are doing and want to push things up a little bit more. In terms of like specific examples about the ways that CCE programs are administering themselves to push that trajectory along, MCE, Marine Clean Energy, recently adopted an integrated resource plan that it's a 10-year plan. This is something they review and then revise annually based on preferences of their governing board, market conditions, and the like. And this has set a trajectory over a 10-year operating period to eventually get to, 90%? 90%. Okay, there you go. So there you go, 80% renewable, 95% carbon-free, where they're kind of pushing the bar themselves, looking at state policies. State policies, of course, recently changed with regard to renewable energy procurement, moving to 50%. They want to go beyond that. That's kind of always been their goal. And I see kind of similar trends and tendencies with this group. So I think you always have the opportunity, and I think we'll feel that push from your customers, from the advocates, certainly from the environmental community, to always do more, and to the extent that the market permits it. I would expect that that will be an ongoing goal and ambition of this organization over time.
Do you think there's, I feel like I kind of made myself very clear last week that Menlo Park would like to see it set higher.
Yeah.
And that, while some people are disappointed at 5% less on the cost, there are other people who are disappointed because they want to see us move as swiftly towards that as possible. What do you think of the idea of us actually, as we set forth, saying, within this time period we expect to be at this, within this time period we set goals from the beginning to move towards the 100%, to kind of keep the fire, to keep the focus?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about this, and I think it's a great kind of challenge for this group to take that on. I would just make maybe one recommendation, which would be, let's see how the responses to this initial RFP look and where that allows you to sit from an operational perspective on day one and for the near term before you start kind of repointing the needle now. So that there's always this kind of, I think, tension between having your foot all the way down on the gas and just kind of moderating that a bit as you go. So yeah, I think once you get a better sense for how things are going to look from a financial perspective and also from a power content perspective on day one, I think it'll make it easier to maybe reset those trajectories over the near, mid, and longer term. And then eventually, I would expect that this board will take up discussion on its own integrated resource plan where you can really lay those specific goals and objectives out with regard to your power supply and strive to meet those over time.
I'll follow up with you after the public comment.
Actually, Segal, I think was
Thank
next.
you.
Yeah.
I have two admin questions. One, is it expected that one vendor will complete all these tasks, or that we'll get multiple vendors for each of those? And when and how will the evaluation committee be created?
Okay, so I'll answer the first question, and then the second question might be one for Jim or others. So with regard to the first question, for the energy services RFP that's kind of being contemplated at this stage, it could be one or more agencies that serve as the initial power suppliers for PCE. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this initial energy services RFP is really only dealing with a small subset in a limited term of, relative to the overall PCE program. So we're talking about roughly 1/3 of the energy requirements compared to full rollout, and a term not to exceed 51 months, so just more than 4 years. And depending on the responses, it could be the case that there is a single supplier selected for that particular role, or there are multiple suppliers, and it really just depends on how the proposals look, what's included in those proposals in terms of the resource mix, and then, of course, pricing and various other considerations related to the evaluative process. Anything else to add?
The only thing I'll add is that obviously there are other tasks that are associated with running the program. So there's the power supply, but then there's also the data manager that, an RFP has already been put out for that. And then, of course, there's just staff that will be employed by this body to administer the program. So I just wanted to make sure in your question, when you talked about a single vendor, it was clear that, really we're talking here primarily about the power supply contract, but there's a whole host of other services and functions that, wouldn't be provided by that entity.
Can I just point out, we're talking about the implementation plan. I don't want to, these are questions about the RFP, and we're on the implementation plan. I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. So, did you have another question, Sarah?
No, but you're right. I was asking about the RFP.
Okay. I just don't want to confuse people too much. So, Sean had a question, and then.
Just had a follow-on question from your question to Kirby. That is relative to the integrated resource plan that PCE will have, and based on sort of new requirements of the CPUC, about when would you surmise that the agency and this board would be looking at a longer-term RFP?
Yeah, I think that's an item that could probably be taken up sometime in 2017. I think, right now, given the timeline, that's probably something that doesn't fit that well. Correct. And then, once the subsequent phases of enrollment are addressed and you get through some of those initial administrative hoops, I think it's very appropriate to start taking that up. And really, even though there may not be an explicit integrated resource plan in existence when phases 2 and 3 are rolled out, there will very much be considerations related to resource diversity and also integration of other kind of demand-side programs, energy efficiency programs that may be developed by PCE as well that go into those future solicitations. So, yeah, I think that's a little bit down the road, but it's something that we kind of need to start talking about and seeding, if you will, in terms of the content sooner rather than later.
Pradeep was next.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring the discussion back to the topic at hand, namely the implementation plan draft. And my understanding was that implementation plan does not limit and constrain the board to make many of those decisions that we are talking about right now, namely carbon-free supplies, namely higher non-renewable or renewable energy resource, etc. So am I right in understanding that the the current implementation plan does not limit the board in any of those discussions that we are taking place. I just wanted to get assurance from.
Yeah, I think you absolutely have flexibility in terms of whether or not you choose to push up beyond those minimum thresholds, and that's why I think it's really careful. You need to be careful about how you set those minimum bars, because that could create a constraint. So if something is expressed as a "we will not launch unless," and that condition cannot be met, that could be problematic. But of course, you can always kind of push through that threshold, whatever it happens to be, at your choice.
So that makes me feel better. The other question I had was, in terms of Catherine and Menlo Park's request, there might be other cities which might be also interested in higher than 50% content. And I understand from the history of CCAs around in the state that it is possible to have multiple quality of service from CCAs. We could have a super clean energy supply at a higher cost and a 50% supply at a lower cost. Is that doable, feasible, and part of the implementation plan scope that we are submitting?
Yeah, that's also correct. So as drafted, the implementation plan contemplates 2 product offerings that would be available at the time of launch. One would be the default offering. That would be the minimum 50% that we've been talking about. And then the other would be a voluntary 100% renewable option. And so, yeah, those 2 offerings would be available to customers immediately.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have another round of discussion among the board before we take action on this. So at this point, I'd like to open the public hearing pursuant to section 366.2 of the Public Utilities Code. David, do we need speaker cards for this, or can people just?
I mean, if folks are willing to fill them out, that would be fantastic, but.
Okay, so anyone in the public who wants to comment, this is the public hearing section of this item. If you could fill out a speaker card, and if you're referring to specific language in the plan, could you refer to a page number on the plan so that we know, can follow along? Is there any from the public who wishes to comment? Okay, seeing none, I will close the public hearing, and we will come back to the board for just a discussion before we take action. And the action will be for approving the resolution with as written or with any modifications we agree to during this discussion. And I will start by just reminding people what Kirby said, which is that this, the implementation plan is a very general plan for what we're doing. The real heavy lifting is going to be when we get to rate setting this first time and every subsequent rate setting. So it's really a question of making sure we have the latitude. So some of these questions are good discussions, but I don't want to get us too bogged down in the details of those percentages just yet. I think that's going to come. I think we'll be doing a lot more of that in a couple of months. Correct me if I'm wrong.
June.
Yeah. So at that point, we can, if anyone wants to comment as far as thoughts on approving a final draft here. Wayne?
One comment.
Go ahead.
That was just to find the subsequent step after we submit the plan, approved plan, to PUC. What is their criteria of approving or not approving of a plan? And have you ever seen not approving a plan from PUC? What needs to be done after that? And would that impact our calendar in any way?
Yeah, good question. So the kind of the term that's used within the Public Utilities Code is actually not approval, it's certification. And so the action that the Public Utilities Commission is actually taking is making sure, certifying, that the submitting CCA program has attended to all of the statutory requirements and addressed those items sufficiently within its implementation plan. And in the past, the way that the process has typically gone is that the document will be submitted to the Commission will review that document, and there will often be a series of questions and answers that go back and forth between the Commission as details related to that plan are clarified. And then after that, once there's agreement on what changes, if any, or elaboration, if any, needs to occur, then the Commission will proceed with the certification exercise and then, of course, notify the CCA program as to whether or not that document has in fact been certified, and that occurs in writing. And that's, as John pointed out, that does occur at the staff level. This is not by the commissioners themselves. And so, to date, my understanding is that, subject to the questions and answers between the CCA and Energy Commission staff, and the resolution of any issues, there hasn't been a non-certified plan. John can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think the goal of the Energy Commission staff is to promote the successful certification of those plans through the resolution of any issues that may be outstanding. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Wayne?
Well, I was just thinking about what some of the discussion about, I think, some discussions about the feel-good factor of what we're doing. Maybe one of the things we should include is not only the word renewable, but how much carbon, are we saving, or the person who's going to buy this plan. And over the years, we can show that they're reducing their carbon footprint. And that might give them a more incentive of, hey, they're doing, and even renewables are not always carbon-free. So with technology advancing through the years, those numbers will go down. So we could use that as a marketing issue. I don't know if this is something you've already done or marketed, or decide it's not a really good marketing tool, but I can see that certain plans, could actually start to look more attractive if people knew that they can count their carbon footprint.
Yeah, if I could respond to that item. I think it sounds to me like the issues that you're bringing up, which are very important, are probably best addressed through customer-focused communications that will likely be developed by PCE, and those would be more kind of directly related to marketing efforts, trying to get customers to understand what it is that they're actually participating in and where this may go over time, as opposed to the implementation plan, which is really more of a get the ball rolling type exercise. I do want to recognize that there was a comment made before about whether or not there should be any mention in the plan at all about the kind of initial carbon-free content, and whether or not, basically how that should be characterized, and so that information might be included, but not included in a way that would create any issues. And so, I think just tying in comments that you just made to that one, I don't know if that's something that your board wants to talk about tonight, and whether or not there ought to be any mention of that in the plan, and if so, how it might be characterized. But just wanted to put that out there.
Jill, you wanted to come earlier.
So first, let me say that I support the language of the implementation plan as written. And I appreciate very much the conversation that we've had tonight. I agree with Kirby that there's this push to move the needle as much as we can and sort of compete with other communities about how far can we go. But we as a board have already said, and the advisory council said, we don't want to buy unbundled RECs in order to say that we're 100%. We don't want the nuclear to be a part of this if we don't have to. We like getting as much renewable as we can, but I also think that many of us have said we want it to be local renewable as much as we can. So keeping those reserves and taking the money that we're bringing in revenue and putting that into local projects that will be renewable forever and will be power that we can rely on is a big part of this. And I think we'll be very proud if we can do that. One more plug, I want to make sure that cities are thinking about adopting for their own cities, that they adopt that higher level of 100% as soon as we roll this out. So with that having been said, I support the language as written tonight.
Cameron.
Yeah, I'll second what Joe said. Back to what Herbie and John and Jeff said earlier, this is a regulatory document that's really one step in the process. I appreciated Rick's comments earlier. I thought it was a good framing of a lot of the issues. But, this plan doesn't presuppose the ability of the board to be able to debate and take action on all of those issues. I think, back to what Joe said, we should be very proud of this plan. It is the most aggressive plan that the CPUC will have ever seen, and it's sort of a testament of the whole Bay Area kind of generally pushing the ball forward, and we're taking a big step in that. But so I think what we have is great, and we should move forward with adoption.
Larry?
I was basically going to say the same thing. I think we're dealing with a regulatory document that's been proven to be successful before, and I see no reason to modify it.
Catherine?
You've said a couple of times, that we'll launch it and we'll see how people respond. And I have kind of a process question, because when you say that, I cringe. In the business world, if I'm going to create box Y and sell it in the market, I would never put it out there and see how people respond. You do research for just noticeable difference and related price elasticity to see what the market, how they're going to respond to things before you put it out. And that's why in the letter we're talking about doing customer research to find out those sensitivities, and with respect to rate parity and the commercial feasibility, and basically polling the community to make sure that we do know that we're not making assumptions. And would that be something that needs to be included in this document, or is that something that we need to queue up for us to vote on at a future meeting?
Yeah, I don't, it definitely doesn't need to be included in this document. It's not a statutory requirement by any means. From my perspective, kind of the best test out there in terms of whether or not people will subscribe to this and stick with it is the success of the operating CCA programs that are out there. And the participation rate is incredibly high in all of those programs. And in light of the kind of advances that you're making with this program on day one, I would fully expect that trend will continue here.
I do tend to think Bay Area is a little bit different, so I would like to see us look in a little bit in the polling, but I will move to discuss that in more depth at a future meeting if that's not appropriate for this document.
So I'll follow up two things. One, I do think we should consider agendizing the idea of some market research in a future meeting. So I think that's something we should, we can talk about it offline, but I actually think I like the idea of some polling and market research. I think it should be a future item. And just thinking about what Catherine just said, when you talk to SCP and MCE about their opt-out rates, they're good, but they also don't really know. I mean, they don't have a good answer for why people are opting out. They have
Right.
in some cases they do, but there's a lot of cases, and so I've been curious about that. So I'd like to see the data too. So I think it's if we can do it feasibly, I'd like to see that also. But we'll do that. That's not in this document though. And then Pradeep.
Actually, I would like to make a motion.
Okay.
I'd like to move to adopt the draft implementation plan as it is structured, given that it's a regulatory statutory requirement rather than setting any policies.
Second.
I'll second.
Okay,
Just for clarification, that's to approve the resolution, which does that.
Yes.
That's who you're doing. Yes. Okay. And Charles seconded.
I already seconded something. Rick can have a second.
No problem.
Is there any further discussion before we vote? Okay then. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It is unanimous.
May I make a follow-up motion that we agendize that discussion?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
guess.
I just move that we agendize that for a later meeting to discuss.
Council, can we do that?
You know what, I was going to suggest that staff will take that request, and we can absolutely.
It's clear that we've asked to see that, to look in,
Staff
discussed if
understands.
feasible.
I was just wanting it to go in the notes just so it doesn't get lost.
Understood. The request has been made.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, the resolution is adopted. We will move on to item number 4, which is the discussion on the energy services RFP. And I will just clarify, we're not taking action on this. We will discuss and perhaps suggest some modifications, but this is actually a staff item that we are simply providing guidance on here. So with that, Kirby, do you want to present on that also?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so we've got here tonight, and I think at some point we'll pop it up there on the screen. Oh, perfect. We just got to hit the forward arrow. Fantastic. So here's another item that we introduced at your last board meeting. This is obviously kind of a key, but not all-inclusive or incredibly long-standing commitment that PCE will need to enter into in order to initiate its first phase of customer service later this year. So what we're talking about here in this energy services RFP is laying out the specifications and requirements for respondents to propose a power supply mix that meets the objectives that PCE has set forth in its implementation plan primarily, and then also some of the additional attributes inclusive of the carbon-free resource mix that have also been discussed and also analyzed in the technical study. And over the past week, we've received a number of written comments, and so really the intent of the presentation that's here tonight is just to kind of go through those comments kind of categorically, and then also open it up for additional discussion to the extent that you all have further input to this process and document. So what we've done, like I said, is just break out the comments that were received into various categories. And so we just want to touch on those items briefly, provide a little bit of feedback as to what things you want to consider in making decisions related to each one of these categories. And so we'll just get going in that regard. One of the key items that came up in written comments was whether or not certain resource types should be excluded or precluded from participating in this particular energy services RFP. And what I mean by that is if there is a certain objectionable fuel type or technology, generating technology that's out there, do we want to be specific in this document that it can't participate? There are already a couple of items like that exist. Coal resources, for example, nuclear resources, those are already excluded. What we're really talking about here is whether or not there are particular types of renewable generating technologies that would otherwise be eligible under the California Renewables Portfolio Standard Program that we should take off the table. Of course, you can do that. That's well within your discretion here. But I think it's important to be aware that narrowing the field of eligible resources, of course, can always impose a marginal increase on the price by way of reducing the scope of resources that the respondents have to meet the renewable supply needs of PCE. And, so that's really something that's on the table tonight. But I think it's important, if we do go down that path of excluding particular resources, that this is something that can also be done through the evaluative process as well, just through consideration of what the environmental impacts are of the specific supply portfolio that's being proposed by individual respondents. So I think we can really kind of drive towards the same end without being explicit in that regard. Of course, that's up to your board how to choose to deal with that. There were also some written comments that were submitted related to consistency with municipal ordinances, programs, and contracts, and more specifically, that the responses that are received have to be attentive to those various items. I think it's just worth noting that amongst the supply community out there that would likely respond to this RFP, there's probably a very high lack of familiarity with those ordinances and programs. And similar to the resource exclusion concept, these are items that I think can be effectively addressed and sorted out during proposal evaluation as well. There were also some comments that alluded to the potential compliance with future programs and policies. Of course, that's pretty tough for a respondent to do. And because certain energy service providers tend to be rather conservative, it's reasonable to assume that the imposition of that sort of requirement would likely limit the responses that you receive. And also, just generally, that would be unacceptable to take that kind of risk for many of these suppliers. There were some concerns expressed as well related to environmental justice as those concerns relate to generator location. One addition that was made in the revised draft of the energy services RFP was the inclusion of additional specifications that need to be provided by each respondent related to its intended mix of generators that will be used to fulfill PCE's energy requirements, and in particular resource location, fuel source, and then general environmental performance, including the anticipated emission rate for each generator that would be utilized to meet PCE's energy requirements. And then as that information is provided, I think we'll have a much better handle on specific impacts to communities of concern, and that can all be addressed as well during the evaluative process without imposing specific requirements in the RFP itself. This one I may turn and look at David, if that's okay. There were some questions that were raised about the use of PCEA versus the county, and maybe I'll stop talking at this point.
Okay, so most of those are going to change. Just as a little bit additional background, what staff did is the county has an RFP template that it uses when it goes out to do requests for proposals, and that actually was a starting point, and it was shared with PEA. And a number of the references to the county are simply going to come out. Not all of them. Some of them need to stay because the county's administering the RFP at this point because JPA doesn't have any staff. But a lot of the references to county are either going to come out, refer to county or the JPA, or just refer to the JPA. And that it's actually already been done. It just hasn't been reflected by the document. And I'd also observe a couple of things. One is I have already retained an outside counsel to assist with both the RFP and, ultimately with negotiation of the energy contracts. He's someone who actually served that role for Marin and for Sonoma and for the city of Lancaster.
Steve Hall.
This is Steve Hall. Ultimately, I anticipate bringing a contract with him to you when the JP has money to pay him. Right now, the county is going to be advancing that money, and so I did enter into that agreement actually today on behalf of the county. And he's also provided some feedback that is going to be implemented, assuming the board doesn't give us contrary direction. And a lot of it's just streamlining. And I think that Kirby may have alluded to this. There are some references to certain county requirements in the RFP. We're probably going to be recommending to staff that a lot of those come out. I could get into specificity, but I won't unless folks ask me to. Nothing would be added. It would be simply taking out certain things that are not strictly necessary. In some ways consistent with the discussion around the implementation plan. In having a long conversation with Steve Hall, the outside counsel, he made fairly clear to me that your goal with this RFP should be to maximize the number of proposers that you get. Ultimately, the more proposers you get, the more competitive the rates and options are, and the more flexibility you have as you then narrow down and negotiate with the energy services providers. So the goal is really just to make it as clean a document as we can. And I don't know if is that responsive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'm very, very glad to hear that Steve Hall will be a part of the team during this process. He's excellent. He's supported a few of the operating CCA programs with their various contract negotiation efforts, and he really is great at moving things along. And I think that's, the comments that Steve made about being kind of overly prescriptive and what that does in terms of narrowing the field of respondents, I think that's spot on, and that's certainly been our experience in the past.
And just to clarify, there are a ton of moving parts in the final contract or contracts we will be signing, but the RFP really doesn't, as David pointed out, the goal is to get the most respondents. The RFP doesn't limit us in any way from negotiating those contracts with, anything that we decide later we might get someone to agree to.
That's absolutely correct. And moreover, because this is just one small piece of PCE's eventual energy requirements, there will be more and more contracts that are put in place over time to address, not only near-term needs, but mid and then longer-term needs with newer resources, potentially anyway, within the state of California. I wanted to draw your attention as well to a couple of specific changes that were incorporated in the draft document. One of them was submitted in writing, and we certainly appreciated receiving it, and was really focused on clarifying that there will be consideration of broadly the environmental attributes associated with the resource mix that's proposed by each respondent, inclusive of conventional carbon-free and renewable energy resources. Appreciated receiving that recommendation. And then we've also, mentioned this earlier, added just a more expansive requirement in terms of the information that needs to be provided related to the generators that would be sourcing, the source generators for PCE's initial energy needs. All right, here we've got, we had a recommendation that was kind of focused on whether or not it would be possible to reflect the potential impact of technological improvements in terms of price reductions over time. I think it's important to note that because of the relatively near-term start date for this agreement, and then the short-term duration of this agreement, it's not likely that any new generating facilities would be brought online during that 51-month term, and as a result, there wouldn't really be much of an opportunity to take advantage of new technologies or improved technologies over that time period. I think the second point is also pretty relevant here too. So you're going to enter into a fixed price contract with an energy service provider, and kind of on the other side, that energy service provider is going to enter into contracts to fix its prices associated with supplying your energy requirements. So because of the fixed price nature of what's going on here, it's very tough to move that price around over time to the extent that things change. I mean, really what you're doing here is creating certainty for the near-term operations of PCE, allowing you to set rates predictably. And so this is an item that I think would probably be better addressed in some of the longer-term agreements that would be put in place by this organization down the road.
Who typically assumes the risk in these initial contracts? Is it the ESP or us?
Yeah, so there's, technically there's a bit of risk on both sides, but it is a fixed price agreement. So from a price perspective, there's a commitment on the part of the supplier, of course, a commitment on the part of the buyer to purchase that power at a particular price, and then and so, depending on the way that the market moves, that risk may shift over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they hedging is that just a general thing, or are they hedging now because the market is actually advantageous to hedge?
Well, I think what's going to happen here, probably a couple of things. More broadly, these energy service providers may enter into hedges to take advantage of where the market is at any particular point in time. But specific to this transaction, there will be hedges put in place to be able to cover the positions that are needed in order to meet the contractual requirements. Okay, so the next item here is focused on what I might broadly characterize as kind of complementary energy programs that may be offered by Peninsula Clean Energy at service commencement or at some point in the future. It's really difficult to kind of tie those programs in or support for those programs through an energy services RFP. These are programs that are really kind of better served and supported through programs that are directly administered by this organization. For example, distributed generation has been very well supported with California's operating CCAs through the implementation of net energy metering tariffs that are comparatively superior to those offered by the incumbent utility, as well as feed-in tariffs to support smaller scale, locally situated renewable resources that serve as wholesale suppliers to the CCA program. And then, things like electric vehicles and energy storage. These are also kind of interests of the program that are more appropriately supported through tariff development to incentivize uptake of those different technologies. And to be perfectly plain, this really isn't a core competency of many of the energy services providers that would be considered during this stage either. There were some comments submitted as well regarding kind of the reliability and safety of supply generally. While I think it was great to raise this question, hopefully it puts everybody's mind at ease that this is really the responsibility of the California Independent System Operator in terms of the wholesale electric system, and then more locally, PG&E in terms of the safe and reliable operation of the distribution system. So we talked last time when we introduced the Energy Services RFP about the idea of a resource adequacy program that's administered by the state of California, procurement of reserve capacity by this particular organization once it commences operation. And that's the type of program as well that kind of contributes to reliable operation of the grid. But ultimately, that is overseen by the ISO and PG&E more locally. So it's really out of the hands of the energy services providers. There were comments focused on timing and whether or not it was too aggressive. And I think, we've got a timeline in place here where the schedule of the RFP is kind of matched to meet the desired launch date of PCE in October of 2016. And then there was also a comment about who's going to be involved that knows much about the energy industry and where's the expertise here. And, even though we've been up here talking with you for a long period of time, tonight and last week and at meetings before this, it's probably worth noting that John and myself and Brian Goldstein, who works with us but couldn't be here tonight, we have considerable experience in the electric utility industry. We've helped launch each of California's CCA programs and have actually helped them identify various suppliers, not just the initial supplier, but subsequent suppliers, and help administer their various solicitation exercises, select the suppliers, as I noted, working with folks like Steve Hall along the way to negotiate contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So we've done this before, and we'd be happy to answer any questions about our qualifications. So I think we've got a good team here, and in concert with staff, and of course, a committee of your board that I believe is going to be formed to help participate in this process as well. I think we'll have what we need in order to get somebody or multiple organizations that are well qualified to meet your needs here. And I think that's all I had. So, any other questions?
So again, we're sort of this is the last comment period for us. I do think we should stick to our timeline in the packet, which is to release this on April 4th. So what I suggest is if anyone has questions or comments, to direct them to staff right now, and then we can move on. When we're done with that, we can move on from there. Does anyone, Pradeep?
Yeah, I just have a very small legal kind of question on the RFP. Is page 9. And it's one of those paragraphs that has a green shading on it, highlighted in green on page 9. It says, and I'm just reading from the draft here, proposers are encouraged to provide a list of all facilities, etc. The use of the word encouraged as opposed to required, why did you choose encouraged?
Yeah, that's a good question. We could certainly make it a more firm requirement. Unfortunately, if it is characterized as a requirement, some of the comments that I made earlier about these kind of hedges or contracts being put in place by certain of these energy services providers, they may not be able to answer those questions. And I think one of the things that will kind of show through in the evaluative process is that if this information is not provided, that's going to be perceived negatively relative to a respondent that does provide that information. We could certainly make that clearer in the evaluative criteria if that's of interest to you. But that's really the reason for that answer, unless you have anything to add.
No, I think that's right. And I would just add that the ESP doesn't necessarily own the generation, right? So they're going to go out and contract with generators, And there is a bit of a timing issue in terms of committing to a particular generator before the time that you're ready to commit to them, right? I mean, so when we get the proposals on April 13th or whatever the date is, contract's not really executed until June. There's a long period of time. So there has to be some flexibility there. So we're looking for that information, but it's probably going to, it may change a little bit during that interim period. And then once we're closer to sort of that best and final pricing and real close to contract execution, then we can nail that list down a lot more clearly. So that's why we haven't said it's absolutely required at this stage, but we do encourage them to provide as much information as possible so that we can help with the evaluation.
Thank you.
Daniel.
First, thank you for that overview. I submitted 5 written comments, and you addressed each of them there or in the language changes, so thank you very much for that. Very comprehensive. While you were talking, I came up with another question. And this may not require any changes to the RFP, but for my own understanding and based on the answer, I don't know if it would require a change. But in the agreement that gets negotiated, what's the penalty if they fail to supply energy, if they fail to do what they promise they will do? And sort of based on that, is there anything that we should put in here that would give us additional comfort that won't happen?
Right, so that will definitely get reflected in the contract that gets negotiated. And so the tie-in, though, to the RFP is, I think it's primarily that credit evaluation. We're asking for financial information, make sure that it is a credit-worthy counterparty, because ultimately, if they don't deliver, we're going to need some recourse, right? But the details of that will be reflected in the agreement itself.
Larry.
A question I had that didn't get addressed, and I think my understanding as to why is evolving, but it has to do with tiered pricing and availability of EV rates for the consumer. Am I now correctly understanding that situation would not be handled by the ESP, but would be a PCE issue in terms of supply and pricing?
That's correct. So PCE will adopt a rate structure that would include, probably EV rates and time of use rates, and just like what PG&E has. So it's not done by the energy supplier. You're buying power essentially on a wholesale basis from the supplier. That becomes part of your cost structure along with other costs, cost of personnel and other costs. Put that all together into a budget, and then you would design, this board would design, staff would do it, this board would approve rates that recover that budget, those budgeted amounts.
Okay, great, thanks. To be honest with you, I think if you left it to the ESP to do, they'd just say everybody should pay a flat rate because that's what's easy. And that's kind of what happens in the direct access world, right? So, that rate setting exercise is really critical to helping PCE promote whatever kind of attributes, if you will, it chooses to promote. Electric vehicles, storage, shifting usage from one time period to another. Yeah, so all that will be addressed down the road, and it will be addressed internally with plenty of opportunity for discussion by your board. Great, thank you.
Gary.
Yeah, thank you. Just out of curiosity, based on our needs and the proposal, how many proposals do you think we'll get back?
That's a good question. It's somebody needs to get a book going here to see who's right. Actually, don't do that. It's a bad idea. Yeah, take that out of the minutes. Realistically, it's really hard to say because I think what you're going to get proposals that fall into 2 buckets. One are going to be conforming proposals, and the other will be non-conforming proposals. So if you take all proposals together, you may well get 10 or 12 proposals, but I think, of those that you receive, you're probably looking at anywhere in the 4 or 5 range that will probably be like on the nose in terms of what you actually need. And that's kind of based on experience, administering similar solicitations for others. And by the way, I think it's probably worth noting that some of those non-conforming proposals, you want to keep those contacts in your Rolodex, so to speak, because those are often organizations that you'd want to work with in the future, whether they're project developers, whether they have specific expertise in program design related to energy efficiency or demand response. It's not that you're really shooing these folks away for good. It's just it might not be a good fit now, and they felt compelled to introduce themselves to you sooner rather than later through this process. So, you know, a lot of this information is still useful, even though it might not be directly responsive.
Wayne?
I have two questions. One is, what is an e-tag?
Yeah, okay, so that's basically, it's electronic information that's associated with an energy transaction, letting you know where the energy came from, where it's going, who's responsible for the transaction. So it's essentially a record associated with the energy that moves from one place to another.
Okay. At the risk of muddling up the RFP, I heard a comment about interest in local produced energy, and I was going to ask the board if that's something we want to include in the RFP, maybe something in the lines of providing us information on the proposal, how much local energy are you providing, how many local generated energy can provide.
I'll just go ahead and point out, and certainly your discussion is welcome, but there's definitely verbiage in the draft RFP now that expresses a real clear preference for local renewable energy resources, and I think that's something that we're explicit about in terms of the evaluative effort and preference that will be given for locally situated resources. So to the extent that those show up, that's going to work in the favor of the respondent that chooses to include them.
So that's not going to limit the amount of replies? I mean, when you get a larger reply, is it as preferable rather than saying?
And actually, that's a really good point, and if you don't mind. So if folks want to look, we're actually talking about page 7 of the RFP, and it's in the first full paragraph, second paragraph total. You'll see a discussion about providing a preference for local, a secondary preference for regional. And I'm actually in the process of working with this language. There's some references to a scoring system, which I think would be somewhat constrictive, and I think that might ultimately come out before this is released. But yes, this will provide basically an incentive for the proposers to call out where they can provide local and regional energy resources, and will give discretion to the board and to the folks who are evaluating this to give that the significance that the board believes and the negotiators believe it deserves. So hopefully that is responsive and helpful.
And just to clarify, a lot of MC and SCP's local energy is coming from subsequent contracts. For the first one. The first one is kind of the basic, get you started, and a lot of the local projects, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of them come from the follow-up contracts, or even ones that were signed at the beginning but not executed immediately.
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate, and and in fact, those, whether it was a feed-in tariff program that's being administered by the CCA, or just bilateral contracts with slightly larger local generators, those opportunities were really sought out very soon after operation commenced. And due to the size being relatively small, we're fairly easily integrated into the resource mix.
Deborah?
Yes, are we expecting the suppliers who respond to the RFP to be suppliers that have provided packages to other PCEs in the state?
Yeah, so that's not a requirement, but it's interesting because there are 3 operating CCA programs in the state right now, with a 4th soon to be operating in May, and each one of those 4 CCA programs has selected a different energy services provider to meet its initial energy needs. So, I think it's likely that we'll get to select from amongst those entities that are already working with operating CCA programs and potentially new ones. So it's not a requirement, but I think that will play well in the demonstration of qualifications.
Are there other questions or comments right now on the RFP? Is there any public question or comment on the RFP?
Good evening. Ann Schneider. I'm the alternate from the city of Millbrae. And I did also turn in comments. I thank you for, and Mr. Eggmeyer and I had a couple of emails back and forth. So I'm happy with the language that was added on page 7. We talked a little bit about that language. The concern was, in my field, if we restrict a number of the solid waste-derived energy forms, that it would be too restrictive in any of the bids that come up. So I can clearly understand by keeping it open right now, that's fine. I also had submitted language about the evaluation criteria. I come from a background of evaluating very large solid waste contracts, and garbage companies tend to take you to court when you do not treat each one of you equally and fairly. So I would only encourage that in the evaluation criteria, things like environmental justice, many of the burn plants in the country are sited in low-income communities of color. So it's not really a problem for us. It's not a local issue. It's not even a regional issue anymore, given that one plant in Oakland's been closed. But I'm just a little concerned on the evaluation criteria. But other than that, I'm happy with the changes that you've made. I think there was one confusion, I think, in how you interpreted my comments. My greatest concern is once our bank account is so big and fat and rich, and we can start supporting the development of local energy, that we be very cautious with the types of companies that we give that money to. Otherwise, I'm perfectly happy with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other public comments on the RFP? Okay, seeing none, then I will, unless there are any other comments, I will close the discussion of this and we'll move on.
Do you need an action from us?
We do not. This is merely, we're there, so I'm going to just suggest that we stick to the plan of releasing on the 4th, assuming that you have what you need from us, and that we'll just continue on the timeline.
Yeah, I think the comments and the responses that we heard tonight really helps us. There's some little bit of refinement and consultation that council needs to do and take care of, and so we're looking forward to issuing this next week.
Great. Okay, so one more note. Anyone who wants to, we will be creating a subcommittee, I know, to review these. Anyone who wants to, is interested in serving should probably forward a letter of interest to Jim, I guess would be the, does that make sense?
Yeah, we'll take your direction. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, so we do need to
Subcommittee of the
subcommittee to review RFP responses as they come in. And then, Dave and I and you can sit down and start.
Right,
that out.
and we'll be the recipient and forward them back to you.
Great. Okay. That brings us to item 5, board members' reports. Are there any board members' reports at this time? Seeing none, I believe we are done.
Secretary appointment, I think.
Sorry, what?
Don't we have secretary appointment?
I think it was taken care of as part of the consent agenda.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, sorry, the consent agenda, Carol did the consent agenda.
And I am now your new secretary until you get tired of me, and then you can appoint somebody.
I'm just following along.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You abstained from the consent agenda.
It's all right. I didn't make any comments.
You were the real
time.
I know it's.
Well,
I don't mean to.
oh, no, it's fine. That's right. Actually.
Like, didn't it on the 10th?